What hadn't you tried? You're already a huge success.
Climbing Mount Everest in the nude has always been.
You can let him do that?
Stop if he wants to, he can.
I'm bulletproof, but I can't fly yet.
He built his whole career on playing a man who never seemed to need anybody. That was the joke and the charm of Mick Dundee, the bushman who could handle anything the outback or a big city threw at him without breaking a sweat. But at 86, the real Paul Hogan is dealing with something no amount of easy charisma can fix. And the person he's turned to for help isn't a doctor, a manager, or one of his 5 other children. It's Linda Kozlowski, the woman he was married to for 23 years, and the woman he's been divorced from for over a decade. This isn't a story about 2 old flames rekindling something romantic. It's a story about how a marriage that fell apart quietly ended up being the thing both of them lean on when life gets hard. To understand why Hogan picked up the phone for her this year, you have to go back to where it all started, a film set in the Australian outback in 1984, long before anyone knew Crocodile Dundee would become the biggest Australian film ever made. By the mid-1980s, Paul Hogan was already a household name in Australia. He'd spent years building a reputation through sketch comedy on television, developing the persona of the easygoing, unbothered Aussie everyman that would eventually define his entire career. But Australian fame wasn't international fame, and Hogan wanted more. Along with his writing partner and close friend John Cornell, he set out to make a film that could put Australia, and himself, on the map in America. That film needed an American lead, someone who could play a journalist from New York who finds herself completely out of her depth in the outback. The role went to Linda Kozlowski, a 20-something actress with a very different background from Hogan's. Kozlowski had trained at the Juilliard School, one of the most prestigious performing arts conservatories in the world, and had already worked on Broadway, including a turn in a production of Death of a Salesman. She wasn't chasing fame for its own sake. She was a serious, classically trained actress who happened to land a role in what would become a massive commercial hit. During filming, something shifted between Hogan and Kozlowski that went beyond their on-screen roles. At the time, Hogan was still married to his first wife, Nolene Edwards, whom he'd wed back in 1958. The two had already been through one earlier split and reconciliation, and this second breakdown, which became public not long after Crocodile Dundee hit theaters, was reported at the time as one of the more difficult celebrity divorces Australia had seen. It played out publicly while Hogan's career was exploding on the other side of the world, with Crocodile Dundee pulling in hundreds of millions of dollars worldwide and turning him into a genuine international star almost overnight. For years after that divorce, in 1990, Hogan married Kozlowski. To the public, it looked like the natural, romantic conclusion of an on-screen love story spilling into real life. What got less attention was the more complicated truth sitting underneath it, a new marriage built in the immediate aftermath of an old one collapsing, with all the emotional weight that comes attached to that kind of timeline. For a while, the pairing worked exactly the way Hollywood loves. Kozlowski reprised her role as Sue Charlton opposite Hogan in Crocodile Dundee 2, and the two also appeared together in Almost an Angel. They became one of the more recognizable couples in the industry, photographed constantly, treated by the press as a real-life version of the characters that had brought them together in the first place. But Kozlowski's career trajectory tells a more complicated story than the tabloids of the era were interested in printing. She was a Golden Globe-nominated actress with serious stage training, and yet the parts being offered to her afterward tended to lean on her association with Hogan rather than her own range as a performer. Being known primarily as Crocodile Dundee's wife wasn't a creative path she'd built at Juilliard or on Broadway. By 2001, following a third and final entry in the Crocodile Dundee franchise, Kozlowski had largely stepped away from acting. There was no dramatic announcement. She simply stopped showing up in film credits. That kind of exit doesn't happen in a vacuum. Whatever she was giving up professionally, she was also settling into a domestic life that looked very different from the one she'd been building for herself in New York theater in her 20s. And that shift in identity, from working actress to wife of a global celebrity, is one of the threads that people close to the couple would later point to when trying to explain what eventually pulled them apart. In 1998, at the age of 40, Kozlowski gave birth to the couple's only child together, a son named Chance. By all accounts, that period of her life brought her genuine happiness, separate from whatever tension was building in the marriage more broadly. Motherhood later in life, after years of a demanding acting career, was something she spoke about as one of the most fulfilling chapters of her adult life. Where things grew more complicated was in how the two of them approached the marriage itself once the initial spark of the film set romance had settled into ordinary domestic life. Hogan, by nature and by his own public comments over the years, was never someone who leaned on emotional language to describe his relationships. He came from a generation and a personality type that measured commitment in practical terms, providing financially, staying loyal, sticking around. Those things to him constituted the substance of being a good husband, and by most accounts he delivered on them consistently for more than 2 decades. Kozlowski's frame of reference was different. She'd trained as an artist, worked in serious theater, built an identity around craft and expression before Hollywood ever entered the picture. A marriage built primarily around financial stability and loyalty, without much room for the kind of emotional or creative partnership she valued, left something missing for her over time. Neither of these approaches to love was wrong on its own. They just weren't the same language, and over 20-plus years of marriage, that gap didn't close, it widened. In October 2013, Kozlowski filed for divorce from Hogan in a Los Angeles court, citing irreconcilable differences. She was 55 at the time. Hogan was 74. Their son Chance was 15. According to reporting at the time, the split was described by those close to the couple as relatively amicable, without allegations of infidelity or public scandal attached to it. Kozlowski sought to restore her maiden name and requested joint legal and physical custody of Chance, along with spousal support. Around the same period, the couple sold their Malibu home to actor Chris Hemsworth as they began dividing their shared assets. The divorce was finalized the following year, in 2014, closing out a 23-year marriage with comparatively little of the public bitterness that had defined Hogan's first divorce decades earlier. What makes this divorce notable isn't scandal. It's the absence of one. There was no third party, no dramatic betrayal recounted in the press, nothing that gave tabloids a villain to point to. It was, by most public accounts, two people who had simply grown into very different versions of themselves over more than 2 decades and finally acknowledged it in writing. Kozlowski didn't disappear from public life after the divorce, but she also didn't chase a comeback. She began spending time in Morocco, where she met a tour operator named Moulay Hafid Baba. The two built a life together centered on travel, and she married him in 2017. It marked a genuinely new chapter for her. One built on her own terms, away from the identity she'd carried for decades as one half of Hollywood's most famous accidental couple. Hogan's post-divorce years look very different and considerably more difficult. For much of the 2000s and into the following decade, he was entangled in a lengthy investigation by the Australian Taxation Office, part of a broader inquiry into offshore financial arrangements that became publicly known as Operation Wickenby. The investigation dragged on for years, at one point resulting in a departure prohibition order that legally barred Hogan from leaving Australia, an order that was in effect when he traveled there for his mother's funeral. He was vocal in the press about how draining the experience was, at one point comparing the ordeal to dealing with the Taliban. The charges were ultimately dropped, and a confidential settlement was reached with tax authorities in 2012. Even after it concluded, the years of scrutiny left a lasting mark on how Hogan's finances and reputation were discussed publicly. As Hogan moved through his 80s, his physical decline became harder to hide from the public eye. He was diagnosed with retroperitoneal fibrosis, a rare inflammatory condition in which scar tissue builds up in the abdominal cavity, in his case, wrapping around the aorta and pressing on one of his kidneys. The treatment involved corticosteroids to shrink the growth, but Hogan has said publicly that the side effects of the steroid treatment were almost worse than the underlying illness. The medication stripped away his muscle mass and body fat to the point that he described needing help with basic tasks, including asking his son Chance to open jars for him because his grip strength had deteriorated so significantly. He eventually needed a pacemaker fitted as well. In interviews given around this period, Hogan spoke candidly about the toll it had taken, describing feeling physically diminished in a way he hadn't anticipated for this stage of his life, while also noting, with some of his trademark dry humor, that staying fit well into his late 70s had been a real blessing he didn't take for granted. In 2025, photos of Hogan being wheeled through Sydney Airport circulated online and sparked concern among fans that something serious had happened. Hogan addressed it directly, attributing it to arthritis combined with a knee injury connected to skateboarding, a hobby he has reportedly continued well into his 80s. In 2025, Hogan and Kozlowski appeared together publicly for the first time in years as part of a wave of nostalgia surrounding Crocodile Dundee's legacy. A newly restored 4K version of the original film, along with a behind-the-scenes documentary exploring the making of the movie and the relationship it produced, brought both of them back into the same rooms and the same interviews for the first time since their divorce. For longtime fans, it was a chance to see Mick Dundee and Sue Charlton reunited on screen decades later. For Hogan and Kozlowski themselves, by most accounts, it was simply an opportunity to revisit the project that had defined both of their lives, professionally and personally, without any indication from either of them that they were interested in rekindling the marriage itself. That distinction matters because it sets up what happened next far more accurately than a romance narrative would. This wasn't two people finding their way back to each other. It was two people who had already made peace with why their marriage ended, coming back into contact through the film that started it all, right before real life handed them something far more serious to deal with together. Chance Hogan, now in his late 20s, has spent recent years pursuing music while also, according to multiple news reports, struggling publicly with mental health and substance issues. In the year before the incident that follows, he posted content on social media that alarmed fans and was widely covered by entertainment outlets, expressing serious emotional distress. Coverage at the time noted that the moment appeared to affect his father deeply, with Hogan reportedly defending his son publicly against harsh tabloid framing. In May 2026, the situation escalated. Police were called to Hogan's Venice Beach home in the late morning over a reported domestic disturbance. According to Fox News Digital and other outlets citing law enforcement sources, Chance had left the property before officers arrived, but was later located and arrested on a domestic battery charge, with bail set at $20,000. Hogan and an unidentified woman were reportedly present and spoke with officers at the scene. The Los Angeles Police Department said it was unable to release further details, citing confidentiality rules that apply to domestic battery cases. Sources cited by entertainment outlets in the weeks following the arrest described Hogan as shaken and exhausted, noting that at 86, he was hoping for a quieter chapter of life rather than a new family crisis layered on top of his existing health struggles. According to some of that reporting, Hogan remained committed to getting his son help while also recognizing the need for firmer boundaries going forward. Some reports also indicated that Hogan reached out to Kozlowski in the aftermath, seeking her involvement in figuring out next steps for their son, including conversations about treatment. It's worth being clear about the sourcing here. Some of these details come from outlets that rely on unnamed sources, and not every specific has been independently confirmed through an on-record statement from Hogan, Kozlowski, or their representatives. What is confirmed through law enforcement and multiple independent outlets is the arrest itself, the charge, and the broader pattern of publicly reported struggles that precede it. It would be easy to frame this as Hollywood's most famous accidental couple finding their way back to each other after everything they've been through. That's a tidier story, and it's the one a lot of headlines have leaned toward. But it isn't what the facts actually support. Hogan has been fairly direct in past interviews that his relationship with Kozlowski settled into something closer to enduring respect and shared history rather than romantic reconciliation. What connects them now isn't nostalgia for 1986 or unfinished business from a marriage that ended over a decade ago. It's something much more grounded, two people who spent over 2 decades building a life and a family together, who still share responsibility for the one thing that outlasted the marriage itself, their son. Paul Hogan built an entire career on the image of a man who didn't need anyone else's help to get through anything. The real story at 86 is a lot more human than that. It's a father dealing with a body that no longer works the way it used to, a son whose struggles have become impossible to keep private, and an ex-wife who, whatever else changed between them, is apparently still someone he trusts enough to call when it matters most. A note on this topic. This script references a family member's reported mental health struggles and a public statement expressing suicidal distress. If you or someone you know is going through something similar, please don't carry it alone. Reaching out to a mental health professional, a doctor, or a crisis line in your area can make a real difference.